Anti-Israel protests and uprisings have taken over college campuses across the country. But are these peaceful protests protected by the First Amendment, or are they unlawful uprisings that should be cracked down upon? Plus, Israel's war in the Gaza Strip continues and is dividing American opinion like never before. Should taxpayers still be forced to fund this conflict? I'm Brad Polumbo, and welcome to Mediaite, your home for commentary and coverage on the intersection of media and politics. Joining us today to discuss and debate all of these things is the political streamer Destiny. Settle in, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to like and comment with your thoughts as we go along. Now, let's get into it. Destiny, thanks so much for talking to Mediaite.
Hey, thanks for having me out here.
So you're somebody who's talked a lot about supporting free speech over the years, but you've also kind of emerged as a very prominent supporter of Israel and kind of defender of everything that's going on right now. How do you look at the kind of campus protests / encampments that are going on right now, and how do you try to square those two values of free speech, but also, opposing anti-Semitism and supporting Israel and in the face of some pretty extreme anti-Israel protests?
I think the important thing is to remember that the opposition to things like hate speech, which I think we should all have, it rests squarely and fundamentally in a different arena than our protection of freedom of speech in terms of like a constitutionally protected right. So I don't like anti-Semitic speech. I don't like hate speech generally. There are things that I don't like, but just because you don't like them doesn't mean you have the right to have the police come in and throw people out. So in regards to these particular protests, I obviously disagree with almost all of them. I think most of them are stupid, but that doesn't mean the police should come in and kick people out. You have to protect people's right to say things that you don't like, Yeah.
What about when they're like doing these encampments, though, where they're occupying buildings or blocking students from accessing public spaces? I mean, that does go beyond free speech, right?
Yeah. If you are violating, there's like an ordinary means or manner or something. There'll be regulations on how you're protesting in different areas. So I think for most schools, you're not allowed to have loudspeakers. You wouldn't be able to do that. I don't know what the regulations are on campuses in regards to like having tents or barricades. I imagine they're probably not favorable to those. And I can't imagine you being allowed to take over a building and then hold it indefinitely for a protest. So in those manners, I would say that police can kick those people out, of course. But it's not really like a freedom of speech thing at that point. It's just you're kind of like breaking the rules or the restrictions placed on you. And we can't have all of a school shut down because a certain group of people decides to protest.
Well, what do you think about some people in the pro-Israel crowd will essentially argue that these agitators, when they stray into pro-Hamas territory, which some of them, I think it's fair to say they have, or when they start chanting things like intifada, intifada, or from the river to the sea, they would say that that counts as incitement of violence and isn't protected free speech. What's your take on that?
It's very clearly protected speech. There is, the Brandenburg test? There are tests that we have that can look very specifically for what an incitement to violent thing looks like. And if you're going to start saying people chanting for an intifada are directly inciting to violence, then I mean, you could argue that there's a lot of pro-Israel protesting, and because of how Israel conducts itself militarily, well, now you're inciting to violence. That's just like a really messy road you never want to go down.
Yeah, I've seen Republican governors, first the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, and now Governor Kevin Stitt in Oklahoma, come out and say different versions of things like hate speech won't be tolerated. And I'm confused, right? Because one, until a minute ago, I thought Republicans were against hate speech bans. And two, even from the perspective of somebody who's really strongly pro-Israel, don't you think that's not going to work out well for you if offensive ideas can get people expelled or censored or punished on campus? I imagine that would be utilized against the pro-Israel side of the argument in a lot of cases.
Yeah, maybe. And it doesn't even matter. There is no such thing legally in the United States as hate speech. We don't regulate hate speech, and we shouldn't. It's part of our First Amendment right to say things that are incredibly hateful or incredibly offensive to people. Again, if somebody's breaking a rule or a regulation on campus, then yeah, you can ask them to leave. And if they don't, then you call on the police and you kick them out. But as long as they're protesting in an orderly manner, they're not disruptive to anything, they're not doing anything that would be against the law or against the rules, they're allowed their say as much as anybody else's.
Would you characterize the protests that we're seeing now, though? Would you characterize them as anti-Semitic, regardless of whether they should be allowed, right? That's a different question. Would you say they're anti-Semitic?
I try not to obsess too much about figuring out the motivations in some cases because it doesn't matter that much, and to try to even figure out is almost impossible. In my opinion, based on where I'm at now and what I've seen, I would say that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism basically look the exact same in practice for the things that people advocate for. But I think the way that they get there is a lot different. So, like when I look at people on the far left, for instance, who are protesting essentially in favor of Hamas, even if they're not saying it, they might not get there through anti-Semitism, but what they're advocating for would essentially in practice be anti-Semitism. So, I don't focus too much on the anti-Semitic part because I think it's self-defeating and it makes it look like you're kind of crying wolf every time you see somebody say something negative about you.
So you think
When you being it.
you think anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic?
I don't think it has to be inherently, but every time I hear somebody say that, it'll be like, just because I'm criticizing Israel doesn't mean that I'm anti-Semitic. And also, all the Jews on the planet support Israel, and that's a huge problem. There should be a one-state solution, and even if all the Jews get kicked out, that's completely okay. Like, even if they all get kicked out of Israel, like, I don't think that state should exist, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, at some point, it kind of looks like you're saying a lot of the same stuff. You've got like Jews controlling the world, Jews controlling all the, military industrial complex. You've got the desire to completely and totally destroy the state of Israel. You've got all these weird claims about like Jewish inbuilt desires to murder and kill like every Arab citizen and every Arab non-citizen. It starts to look like identical at some point. Again, I don't like obsess too much over, like, I'm not going to call somebody anti-Semitic. I'll just argue the positions, but.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen anti-Semitism involved in some of these protests, and it's always hard to get a sense of what percentage of a group agrees with this, because you can nutpick any protest movement, any activist movement, and find a few crazy people. They did this with the Tea Party. But there's also a lot of Jewish students involved in these protests right now, and I would be pretty reticent to just quickly label them self-loathing or anti-Semitic, or I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I have seen a lot of people doing that, and it doesn't feel charitable or intellectually open or honest to me to do so.
I mean, it's hard not to. What people say this a lot. Like, there's a lot of Jews involved there. I mean, like, I'm sure there were some black people that supported Jim Crow. Like, I mean, who cares? 90% of the Jewish people support.
Hold on, is opposing Israel's war or their policies is not equivalent to supporting Jim Crow?
If it was just that, then maybe, but it's never just that. Like, I haven't seen people, when I argue with people or when I see people protesting, it's never just stop the war. It's like, this is like a test that I've developed. It's the worst thing ever. Whenever you see somebody who's protesting dramatically, like against this war, go and see what they were tweeting on October 7th and October 8th. And it's always some variation of like, this is what resistance looks like. And Israel has no one to blame but themselves. And this is what happens when you do this. And God bless the Hamas freedom fighters. And yes, this is what armed struggle and blah, blah, blah. It's like, Jesus, this is like unhinged stuff. But to my further point also, like 90% of Jewish people support the existence in some form of the state of Israel. And I think the majority of the protesting pretty clearly opposed to the entire state of Israel on like settler colonialism grounds. So to constantly point to the few Jewish people, especially like what was like Jews for Peace, these people that show up and they're like, oh, look, like there's a lot of Jewish people involved. No, there's not. That's a very, very minority position, at least in the Jewish community.
Yeah, I mean, it can be a minority position for sure. I think the self-hating label is used a lot. And like you said a minute ago, it's not really an argument, right? It doesn't even actually make what they're saying true or false or less true or less or more correct. But I do think that there is an anti-Semitic tone to some of the protests for sure. But I also think we're seeing a genuine groundswell uprising of people who are really concerned about what Israel is doing. We've all seen the horrifying videos of the dead women and children, the war zones, the chaos, and I think there's at least some degree you surely would acknowledge of these protests are people with genuine concerns who care about these people that are being harmed.
No, I don't think so. I think it's all social pressure. I think it's all like America bad, like youth. The majority of these, I've never met a single protester who has any idea what any of the protesting is actually about. Like they'll say things like history didn't start on October 7th. But I guess for them, like history starts on like 2018 with the Great March of Return. Like none of these people have any idea what they're even protesting about. They don't understand the implications of what they're asking for. They don't understand the parties involved. They don't understand the motivations on either side. They don't know anything about any of the surrounding regions, right? Like you ask somebody like how many people died in the Gaza and Israeli war right now. And they're like, 34,872 and 16,427 of them were children at the age 18 and under, and 18,287 of them were women. It's like, okay, do you know how many people died in the Syrian civil war? Do you know how many people died of just starvation in Yemen? Do you have any idea how many people died in the Iraq-Iran war? Do you know how many people died in the totality of the Iraq war? Do you even know how many people died of Ukraine, Russia? Like, no one has any concept of anything. Even in the region, no one has any idea of like what's going on. It's like, we need regime change for Netanyahu. We got to get this guy. Really, that's the one we need regime change for. Even though we opposed it with Gaddafi, we opposed it with Assad, we opposed it with Saddam Hussein, we opposed it and cheered on the Houthis. This is the guy that has to go in the middle. It's like, nah, I don't buy any of it. I think it's all uneducated, stupid America bad protesting. But hey, maybe I'm just jaded.
I don't know. I definitely think some of them are deeply unserious. You see the videos of the woman asking for humanitarian aid, aka like pizza, to be delivered to the student protesters or whatever. And I do find some of them in these moments will go viral, and it's hard to say whether they're really representative of the protest. Some of them are unserious and almost laughably so. And I do question whether these protests are even advancing their cause at all or actually sabotaging it.
I think the issue when you get a lot of anger like this, and this is one of the things that frustrates me about a lot of the mainstream people that talk about this particular conflict, is that there is a lot of energy, but the problem is because people don't have a good understanding of everything going on, the energy is highly misdirected or not directed. So you end up with these situations where you have like Occupy Wall Street or BLM, where people are mad, and you can understand that they're mad about things, but then the policies they're pushing for are like nonsense. So like with Occupy Wall Street, it was like businesses shouldn't be people. And I was like, do you even know what that means? Like, what do you even say here? Or like in BLM, it's like, we need to defund all the police and also increase all the training and increase all the body cameras and increase everything else that would cost way more money. It's like, and nothing came from that. And it's the same thing with this. It's like, what are we going to do? Like defund our support for Israel? Like, would you even care? Like, let's say we stopped funding Israel. I do no longer care about the topic now. Like, it's not like we provide 100% of their military budget. It's not like they wouldn't be able to find any of that money elsewhere. Like, it's not like all of a sudden Palestinians can win against Israel because they don't have military funding from the United States. Like, it's all just like undirected energy and chaotic.
But it is worse, though, when you're being forced to fund something through your taxes than it is if it's just happening somewhere else in the world with no real tangible involvement to you or your country. That is, I think, worse. I think it's fair for people to be more concerned by that.
Yeah, you can, but I don't buy that if we stopped funding them, they would all of a sudden be like, oh, okay, I'm happy now. I would think if your anger is at 100% and then the United States like withdraws funding, I think your anger is like 99%. I don't think it matters that much.
I mean, I certainly agree people would still be upset about what's happening, but I do think it adds an extra dimension to it when we're literally funding it. I mean, and that kind of brings us to the second thing I want to talk about, which is this additional 26 billion that was just passed, bipartisan nature, and then signed into law by President Biden, 26 billion in US aid to Israel. Some of that is humanitarian aid for the Gaza Strip. Some of it is Iron Dome defense funding, and some of it is weapons aid and offensive military aid. What's your stance on that? Were you supportive of sending billions more in resources and dollars over there for this?
Yeah, I'm generally supportive of assisting U.S. allies, U.S. friends. I'm generally supportive of funding for Ukraine. I'm generally supportive of funding for Israel. I do think that it's good, and the United States needs to continue to kind of like rein in the potential humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. So building that pier is good. Pressuring Israel to open up more ports or passages is good, to try to make sure that food is not only just getting into the Gaza Strip, but also being distributed, because they're having big problems with distribution in there as well. So it's important to keep them reined in somewhat, but it would take a lot for me to say we need to just stop funding somebody we consider an ally.
Well, I don't see why we should be funding it at all for a couple of reasons, but one of which is just the majority of Americans no longer support what Israel is doing. I mean, we've got Gallup polling from March of 2024. 55% of Americans now disapprove of Israel's military campaign in Gaza. I don't see why should they be forced to fund something they don't support. A majority of the public doesn't support this.
I would have to, what is the breakdown on polling like that? Does that draw evenly from every age group? Because my understanding is that right now the opposition skews very, very, very heavily on the younger side. I don't know if the older side has started to switch on that opinion yet, but I mean, if the question is like, should our funding only go towards whatever currently has popular support? But my answer is going to be, well, no, I don't think that's how funding for the U.S. should work. That if like the polls sway a few points, all of a sudden we pull the plug on whatever international ally we have. I think the United States will be seen as incredibly unreliable at that point.
But we're not talking about library funding, right? We're talking about weapons. We're talking about aid that's being used to kill people. Probably one of the most controversial forms of spending you could have.
But yeah, the answer doesn't change. I mean, like the same question is going to, I mean, hopefully it does, but the same question is going to come up in Taiwan soon, right? And let's say that the support for Taiwan is like 53% of the United States and they get engaged in a huge struggle against China. Are we pulling the plug on that when the polling changes to 49%? I think we have to have a bit more sophisticated of an approach to foreign policy than just what does the current Gallup poll say about Americans' opinions about a current conflict?
Well, I think when you have a huge swath of the public that, I mean, rightly or wrongly, they do believe what's happening is a genocide. They do believe Israel's targeting civilians. I think the idea that their money's being forcibly taken out of their paychecks and sent over there to fund that is really strongly objectionable from a freedom of conscience point of view.
Vote for new leaders. I mean, that's all you can really do then. Make sure in the next election, I guess, it was a strong issue for you. Make sure your voice is heard and vote accordingly.
I also don't understand, though, why Israel needs this aid. I mean, Israel is an incredibly wealthy nation. They have a very advanced military, and they're up against Hamas. It's a David Goliath situation, right? It's not a close fight. They're not evenly matched, right? They already have an enormous military advantage. Why do they even need our aid or need our assistance? Why is that even necessary?
I think one is because Israel doesn't see itself as only opposing Hamas. They also see themselves fighting basically proxy wars with Iran. So that might come in the form of missiles shot from Yemen, from the Houthis. It might come in the form of attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon. It might come in the form of attacks of proxy groups that stage attacks from Syria into Israel. They still see these other fronts as being somewhat active for other people that they're fighting in the region. And then Israel has to conduct an incredibly expensive war because Israel, as much as people say they're just flattening Gaza and they just want to blow everything up, they're not. And the precision guided munitions, the videos where you see like 3 or 4 people getting shot by a singular missile, like these missiles are really expensive. The types of ISR you're doing, the types of weaponeering you're doing, you're spending like, $500,000, $1 million plus on some of these strikes. It gets expensive unless you do want them to just carpet bomb everything, in which case it's a lot cheaper. But the civilian death toll would actually be unbelievably high at that point.
I mean, they have flattened most of northern Gaza, no?
No.
So many people have been displaced and don't have homes to go back for. You can see video after video of just entire streets of destroyed buildings.
Yeah, there are certain blocks that have been heavily damaged, and you see the exact same drone footage of these same places over and over and over and over again. But we heard the same thing in 2008, heard the same thing in 2014, that all of Gaza is flat and nobody will have anywhere to go, and somehow they all find houses again. The humanitarian aid pours in, you rebuild, and people have places to go. And I mean, like, it's tragic, it sucks. I'm not trying to downplay how horrible the war is, but I'm also trying to push against the weird over exaggeration on the other end that like all of Gaza is destroyed. You look at some of these numbers, people will be like 80% of buildings have been completely destroyed, and then you look at where the numbers come from, and it's like, it's actually like 34% of buildings have been damaged and like 12% have been like completely destroyed, because that 80% was actually just houses in like a certain city. And it's just like so much exaggeration and misinformation. I was going through 2 days ago for preparation for another debate for the starvation claims. And man, over the past like 5 months, I had like 50 different articles that came up. That's like imminent mass starvation, imminent people about to start starving to death, starvation deaths about to pass over the deaths from the airstrikes for 5 months. Every single day there's like a different article about this. Like, holy Jesus. And like up to this day, and it's tragic if it's happened, but up to this day, going with the most favorable number, which is Al Jazeera reporting Hamas, 32 people have died from either starvation or malnutrition or disease related stuff related to starvation. Like 32 people, which is tragic. But in an area of 2 million people, we've been told for months they're all about to die of starvation. Like, what's actually happening here with the reporting?
I mean, there's always this fog of war, especially when you have authorities that are run by extremist groups, right? You don't have good information, but it seems hard to deny that there isn't a huge swath of people who have been displaced, that there aren't huge civilian casualties and a human loss being incurred right now, and that there's not a dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You wouldn't deny that, would you?
There's definitely a humanitarian crisis. There's definitely been a huge amount of people that have been displaced, more than at any point in the history of this region, for sure. There have been a lot of civilian deaths, but I mean, it's also we're conducting warfare in an area where you have the highest density of civilians ever. I hear this repeated over and over and over again, and you're trying to remove an enemy that is doing everything they can to induce these exact same types of mistakes, right? Hamas doesn't fight with a military garb. Hamas fights from hospitals. They hide munitions in buildings. Like, all of this stuff has been reported by Amnesty International. You don't have to take Israel's word for it. They operate out of hospitals. And when we say fog of war, it's also not just fog of war. The Al Ali hospital bombing that everybody said for, like 4 days was bombed with a JDAM by Israel that ended up being complete horse bull or whatever. I don't know if you'll be cussing here or not, but like the idea that this is
Stories
just
from the
fog of
Israel
wars.
side that have turned out to not be true as well.
Yeah, sure, but that was like, yeah, on October 18th. That was like in the first week or two of the war, and you have this like idea that Israel is just bombing a hospital and blowing it up completely and killing 500 people, and that's not just a fog of war report. That was a total BS claim that
But Israel
everybody ran
has
with.
bombed some hospitals in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, they have. I mean, but also Hamas operates out of hospitals. We just saw that Al Shifa raid a month
Yeah.
ago, right? Where 900 people ended up getting arrested in that conflict. Is when you start operating out of hospitals, hospitals lose their distinction as a non-military target, and this is what Hamas does.
I mean, is there any limit to that though? Like, is there any? I understand what you're saying, and that is one of the points that gets debated in this, right? Is like it is a safe zone, but then when you start using it for military purposes, is it fair game? But I mean, is there any limiting principle to that? If there's
Mm-hmm.
50,000 people you had to shoot through, obviously that's not the case. But I'm like, is there any limiting principle to how much damage you can do just to get to Hamas? Because pretty much everybody who's rational agrees that Hamas is a terrorist group. Israel has a right to try to destroy them. But is there any limiting principle to how many innocent people can be caught in the crossfire before Israel has a moral obligation to not pull the trigger on some of this stuff?
Yeah, you're supposed to be doing proportionality analyses to make sure that the amount of civilian harm that's being caused is like in proportion to the overall aim of your military objective in any given individual attack. So, I mean, you're hoping that they're doing these proportionality assessments. But I mean, when you look at the overall number of deaths and you compare like the ratio of civilians killed to militants killed, even if we go by the most favorable numbers, which are Hamas numbers, I think they came out and said like 7,000 or 8,000 of the dead were militants. That's still like a 1-to-3, 1-to-4 ratio of militants to civilians, which is already lower than any other armed conflict we've ever seen in the most densely populated area. So the idea that Israel is like indiscriminately bombing civilians, it doesn't pass any sort of numbers test at all. Like it seems like there is an incredibly high level of discrimination going on here if that's the ratio in the hardest to operate environment against an enemy that is trying to induce these types of mistakes.
What do you mean by discrimination?
Discriminating between civilian and non-civilian targets, or discriminating against military and non-military targets. Most people claim that the fighting is indiscriminate, that they're bombing whatever, but it seems like a high level of discrimination must be happening if the ratio of militant to civilian killed is like 1-to-3, 1-to-4.
How do you square that with the fact, though, that Israel has instructed people to evacuate to certain areas and then bomb those areas? Or at the beginning of this conflict, I was much more sympathetic to the argument that you're making that Israel, because in the past, I think Israel has shown a record, their military, of taking a lot of care to minimize civilian casualties. But there's a lot that's different about this war than past conflicts. And I feel like they have done things that really jeopardize that status of we're one of the most civilized militaries in the world. They have done things that really seem to jeopardize that in the minds of a lot of people.
I don't think so. I think it's just the numbers. I think it's just because it's a larger war. People see like the number 30,000 and then they like lose their mind, and that's about it. Again, it's pretty obvious. Like if you look at the numbers, nothing stands to scrutiny that it would seem to be the case that they're just indiscriminately bombing civilians. People use that. They've declared safe areas and then they bomb the safe areas. That's not true. The only one area that they've truly declared as safe that they will not bomb is that Al Mawasi beach. That's the only one they've said that if you go there, we're never attacking that. It's not going to happen. And to my understanding is up to this point, they have not. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of people displaced. I agree with that. There's humanitarian crisis, a potential famine or potential starvation looming. I agree with that. And they need to do more probably to ensure that aid goes through the area. It also seems like they're moving a little bit too quickly with some attacks like that. The the WCK, like the bombing of the 3 trucks. That's a hard one I don't know what is going on there. Like even if there is Hamas operators in these trucks, the idea that you would approve a strike on vehicles like that is unbelievable to me, unbelievably stupid. So they've definitely made mistakes and they've definitely done things where it's like this, you definitely need to slow down here. But again, if you look at the overall conflict so far and you look at what's been repeated over and over again, most densely populated area. Okay, well then shouldn't the ratio be like 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 or 30-to-1?
I don't know. That would be even more horrific than what we are seeing. But I also think you have to consider not just the number of people that have been killed, right? But also the second and third order effects and consequences. There are so many people who have sustained injuries, right? Who will go on to die because of lack of antibiotics and disruptions to the healthcare system. There are so many people who will there are so many second and third order effects of what this will happen, disrupted medical care, cancer screenings, all sorts of things, medications being disrupted where people will continue to die over the years to come. I mean, there's still thousands and thousands of missing people who are likely buried under the rubble somewhere. So to even just say that the current numbers that we have are favorable, I'm not sure those numbers even capture the full toll of the human devastation involved here, though.
Sure. I mean, it's a tragic scenario, but like these conversations are always so interesting because Israel is burdened with 100% the task of removing Hamas, and then Israel is burdened with 100% the task of taking care of the enemy population. Why is Hamas not trying to set up any humanitarian corridors with Israel? Why has Hamas not invested any money whatsoever in building bomb shelters for the civilians? Why has Hamas not done anything they can to protect their civilian population, which is also part of like the law of armed conflict? You're supposed to do what you can to minimize damage in your own civilian population. Much to the contrary, they operate again in a way to induce as much civilian death as possible. So I mean, like the theater that Israel is operating in is the most challenging theater probably that anybody's ever operated in when it comes to urban warfare. And the cost to civilian lives on the other end is indeed great. I do agree with that. It's tragic. But I mean, like, what is the alternative? Like, is it, well, the alternative when you talk to people is, well, Israel just shouldn't be conducting this war whatsoever. Why? Like, is there no right to move or to remove Hamas from this region at all? Does Israel have no valid cause for war when they suffered literally the greatest single loss of life since the Holocaust? Not to invoke the dumb Holocaust memes or whatever, but like for almost like what, like 80, 90 years? I don't think there's ever been like a single attack, even in any of the wars that Israel competed in, where as many people have died. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's tragic, but I mean, yeah, tell Hamas to release the hostages and leave. I mean, like, geez.
I mean, look, obviously Hamas is an evil death cult. I mean, that's the answer to your everything you've just said. Why aren't they doing any of these things? Because they're sick, because they don't care about human life. They don't care about Palestinian life. I spoke with Justin Amash, Palestinian American Republican, and he talked about this, how nobody's been worse for the Palestinian people than Hamas, right? But at the same time, Israel, obviously, I think the world has higher expectations for the government of Israel than they do for a rogue terrorist group. That's
hold on, wait, we're just real quick. Hamas is not a terrorist group, and Hamas is not a rogue terrorist group. Hamas is the government of the Gaza Strip. They represent the government. They administer to it. It's not just like a random group of terrorists. That is the elected at one point, and now the current government, not de facto but de jure administrator of the Gaza Strip.
It's close to a failed state. I mean, they don't have effective governing power over the Gaza Strip right now.
Right now they don't, but up to the invasion, they absolutely did. They were administrators to the region. They ran the region. They did distribution of funds. They ran the healthcare. It was the government of the Gaza Strip.
I mean, they can still be terrorists and also be a government.
They can, but when people use that word terrorist, you get this fleeting idea of like these people that live in the shadows or operate underground, and they weren't. There was the Gazan Health Authority. All of these Gazan ministries report to Hamas. Hamas was the governing body of the region.
But I don't think people have the same expectations of them that they do of the Israeli government and military. And I don't think Israel can simultaneously claim to be like, the only democratic, the only liberal democracy in the region and all these things that are more or less true, but then also be like, well, why do we have different expectations than Hamas or than these other regimes? Like, well, you just answered your own question. That's why they have different expectations, right?
That can't be the case, because the issue is that ever since the fall of the Soviet Union from 91 onwards, the world has seen an increase in non-state actors in these not official, not hugely recognized groups that are conducting these forms of asymmetrical war that are meant to basically goad the international community into thinking that the people that they want to strike are always the bad guys. And people don't understand that when the reason why we have international humanitarian law, the reason why we have law of armed conflict, so you're trying to balance very carefully two equally important drives. One is the minimization of civilian harm, and the other is the capability of nations to defend themselves. And the reason why these are equally important is because if one of the balances gets off, nobody will participate. If you start telling countries, hey, listen, I know you want to strike back against these people, but like, man, you're so big and powerful, and they're so small, and they're hiding behind so many civilians, you can't really do it. Then eventually, at some point, nation states are going to go, oh, okay, well, this is dumb. We don't care about any of the rules, because we're not going to allow you internationally to tell us that we have to endure an unbelievable amount of civilian death, destruction, harm, or terrorist attacks from a group that we can see, but we can't go after them because they're too good at posting TikTok videos, because they're too good at using their civilian population as a shield. I think if anything, I think it's a bit contradictory to what we should be doing, is that when you empower nations to fight against people like this, what you do is you send a message that like these types of people are not going to be good for your population. They're not going to be good for you. You're not going to support them. You see that like in the Gaza Strip, for instance, the support for Hamas has fallen, and in the West Bank, it hasn't. But that's because the people in the Gaza Strip have now seen like, well, shoot, if we've got these people operating in our region, we're going to get exploded. It's not good. It doesn't work out for us. But when you have all this unlimited international protection for terrorist groups to operate, you say, whoa, well, you can't fight them. Look at all the civilian death. You're essentially like affirming that operating in that manner is good, right? The reason why a human shield works works. The reason why Hamas is able to operate as it does is because there's a tactical and strategic advantage you expect to gain from utilizing a human shield. The Japanese didn't use human shields against the United States in World War II because it wouldn't work. We were just bombing everything, right? Germany didn't use human shields against incoming factions in the Western Front in World War II because you can't. Nobody would use it. The Russians didn't use it. The Soviets didn't use human shields against Germany because you can't. It doesn't do anything. But this non-state actor versus state actor paradigm that's set up with this asymmetrical warfare, where it's like, well, as long as enough civilians die on our side, we'll always look good internationally. That can't be leading to a competent, a cohesive world order. It doesn't work.
No, I understand what you're saying, but and I'm glad that support for Hamas is going down, right, in the Gaza Strip. But I don't think that means that support for extremism or violence towards Israel is going down. Those aren't quite the same thing. And I just worry, if you try to put yourself in the shoes of a 12-year-old Gazan boy who a bomb's been dropped on their house, killing their dad and their mom, or just one of these people whose lives has been decimated. I mean, wouldn't you grow up to be an extremist? Wouldn't you grow up to want to hurt the people who hurt you, who ruined your family, who destroyed your home in any way imaginable? Doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's morally justified or valid or anything, but it is, to some extent, human nature. That's what I wonder. Obviously Israel has this right to destroy Hamas, but how many future terrorists are they willing to make in the process of getting rid of every last single Hamas member?
If you really care about that, then you have to ask the question on both sides. Too many people ask the question on one side. They'll say history didn't start on October 7th. It's like, okay, well, what do you mean by that? Well, Israel's a history of doing bad things to the Gaza Strip. Okay, well, where did that come from? What about the blockade? Okay, well, history didn't start in 2005. Why did the blockade happen? Well, I don't know, because Israel hates the Gaza Strip. No, well, no. What do you mean? You don't think there's any reason why it was blockaded? You don't know anything about the Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip. You don't know anything about the Second Intifada. You don't know about any of the terrorist attacks that have led up from the inception of the PLO to where we are right now. Like, I agree with you that you might be radicalizing people in the Gaza Strip, but why don't we think Jews have been radicalized, right? When you've got people internationally defending the Houthi slogan of death to America, death to Israel, and a curse upon the Jews, and people are like, well, hold on. Is that really the worst slogan ever? You got people defending the Houthis attacking international merchant ships passing through, international waterways. Why would we expect Jews are not getting radicalized when you've got terrorist attacks coming from Hezbollah? When you've got Iran shooting, 200 plus missiles and stuff in Israel? Why would we expect Jews not to be radicalized? I agree. Again, I'll reiterate. I agree that I can see the radicalization of people happening in response to attacks, but for some reason, only one side is supposed to ever get radicalized. Israel got radicalized after the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005, and you can very clearly see it when their whole government has veered off into this insanely rightward direction, and it hasn't recovered and hasn't come back. But it's largely because of the events that happened in that span of 4 or 5 years. But nobody ever seems to care about the radicalization of the other side, only their side.
But shouldn't they learn from that? Shouldn't they have seen what happened in their own country and be like, okay, or also what the U.S. has done in our war on terror and the blowback that has incurred in many cases, right? This is a studied phenomenon that of blowback in anti-terrorism, in counterterrorism. And I don't know what the ultimate solution is here. I certainly don't know. You obviously don't have to have one either, but I'm not convinced that eliminating every single last member of Hamas at any cost is going to be in the long run interest even of Israel's own security.
Blowback is, in my opinion, the way that people talk about blowback is a very naive approach to international politics. Like, can we do things in some areas that come back to us in unintentional ways? Absolutely, of course. No one's going to deny that. But to say that means that we can't operate against any non-state actor or any terrorist group ever,
I don't think anyone's saying that.
Well, sure, but were we wrong to destroy ISIS? Were we wrong to eliminate Al Qaeda? Like, we don't hear as much from either of these groups as we used to. Is it wrong to fight against certain terrorist groups, or is it wrong to try to remove certain things just because there might be blowback in the future? I don't think so. I think it has to be a bit more sophisticated of an analysis to figure out when it's right or when it's wrong. I do agree. I'll agree with you that Israel needs to have a good plan after they've removed Hamas from the Gaza Strip. I personally think that the blockade needs to disappear completely because they were the biggest justification for having the blockade up. And maybe that would help to ease a lot of the tensions there in terms of bringing in humanitarian aid, in terms of allowing people to travel in and out, in terms of allowing more goods and services to flow. But I agree you have to do something to counter it, but it can't just be blowback and civilian harm. And they have to stop doing everything because the other side, was successful in utilizing their civilian population in their military efforts.
All right. Well, I don't think either of us have the solution, but it's good to hash out these things and keep discussing them. And that's the only way we're going to come to any sort of agreement or common understanding is by hashing them out. So I appreciate you sticking your neck out for free speech with everything that's going on, even for the people you disagree with. I don't think we're going to agree on the question of Israel funding, but thanks for coming on and hashing it out, Destiny.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, that's it for this debate. Thanks so much for tuning in, and please do consider subscribing and hit that like button if you found this conversation interesting or insightful. Let us know in the comments who you would like us to feature in a debate next, and with that, we'll see you all next time.